On Christmas Eve, 78-year-old veteran James Carter is handcuffed in the snow while delivering gifts to children at Grace Community Church, mistaken for a threat by a new neighbor's call. Officer Ryan Miller's aggressive arrest, captured on body cam, injures James and sparks outrage when reporter Sophia Chen exposes the footage. The community rallies, veterans protest, and Chief Thompson resigns, accepting responsibility. James, now recovering, faces surgery but finds support in unexpected places. What secrets did the footage reveal? Will justice prevail in Milfield, or will trust remain broken? Uncover the truth with us. Thank you for following James Carter's story. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more stories of truth and justice. Your support helps us amplify voices like James's, ensuring compassion prevails. Join our community, share this story, and stand for what's right. Hit subscribe now at channel. The biting Ohio winter gnawed at James Carter's bones as he stood outside Grace Community Church, the snow falling in soft, relentless flakes that clung to his weathered veteran's cap. At 78, his joints ached with arthritis, a cruel reminder of time's unrelenting march. But his spirit burned with purpose. Each year for 15 winters since his beloved Martha's passing, he'd made this pilgrimage through Milfield's snow-dusted streets to deliver gifts to the children of the church. The canvas bag at his feet held treasures, hand-carved wooden toys, puzzles, and books, each wrapped in bright paper and tied with bows knotted by his trembling hands. The effort was slow, painful, but sacred. These small acts of kindness kept her memory alive, a tether to the life they'd built together in this small town over 4 decades. James caught his reflection in a nearby shop window, his silver hair still cropped in the sharp military style he'd worn since his days as a Marine in Vietnam. His eyes, creased from years squinting through jungle heat and gunfire, held a quiet resilience. He stood tall, his posture unyielding despite the cold seeping through his coat. "One more Christmas, old man," he whispered to himself, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The town glowed under the soft twinkle of Christmas lights, a picture-perfect scene that belied the loneliness he often felt. His children, now grown and settled in Cincinnati, had urged him to leave Milfield, to be closer to them. But this town was his anchor, its familiar streets, the church's steeple, the memories of Martha's laughter echoing in their old home. Leaving would feel like abandoning her. He arrived early, as always, positioning himself near the church entrance to greet the children with their gifts. The anticipation warmed him against the chill, each imagined smile a spark of joy. He pictured their wide eyes, their small hands clutching the presents he'd spent all year crafting. This was his tradition, his way of giving back to a community that had held him through grief. Across the street, however, Diane Miller watched from behind her living room curtains, her heart racing with unease. New to Milfield, she didn't know James or his story. To her, he was just an old man lingering too long near the church where her children would soon gather for the Christmas Eve service. His large bag, slumped in the snow, looked ominous in the dim streetlight. Her mind churned with worst-case scenarios, stranger danger, a threat to her kids. She gripped her phone, hesitating only a moment before dialing the police. "There's someone suspicious outside the church," she reported, her voice tight with worry. "An older man with a big bag. He's been standing there for 15 minutes, just watching." Officer Ryan Miller, no relation to Diane, was patrolling the quiet streets when the call came through. At 32, he was still finding his footing in Milfield's small police department, a far cry from the frenetic pace of Columbus where he'd started his career. The slower rhythm of small-town life suited him, but tonight, Christmas Eve, felt too quiet, almost stagnant. The call sparked a flicker of adrenaline. His supervisor had left early for family festivities, leaving Ryan as the senior officer on duty, a role that filled him with both pride and pressure. He pulled up to the church, lights flashing silently, and spotted James immediately. An elderly man, standing ramrod straight despite the cold, a bulky bag at his feet. Ryan's training kicked in, his hand resting instinctively on his holster as he approached. "Sir, step away from the building," Ryan called, his voice sharp with authority. James turned, his weathered face creasing in confusion. "Is something wrong, officer?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with a faint tremor of concern. He wasn't used to being questioned, Not here, not in Milfield, where everyone knew his name and his story. Ryan's eyes narrowed, taking in the bag, the man's steady posture. We got a report of suspicious activity. What's in the bag? His words were clipped, his patience already fraying. Just gifts for the children, James replied, gesturing to the canvas sack. I do this every Christmas Eve. Pastor Mike can verify. Ryan's mind raced. The call had mentioned a suspicious man, and here was an elderly stranger with a large bag, loitering near a church full of kids. He didn't know Pastor Mike, didn't know James Carter, didn't know Milfield's traditions. All he saw was potential risk. Hands where I can see them, he interrupted, reaching for his handcuffs. James's heart sank, a mix of disbelief and indignation rising in his chest. Son, there's a misunderstanding, he said, his voice steady but edged with urgency. I'm James Carter. I've lived here 40 years. I was just waiting. Hands behind your back now, Ryan snapped, his patience gone. The weight of being the senior officer pressed on him, the need to assert control overriding any instinct to listen. I won't ask again. James's eyes flashed with a spark of defiance, the same fire that had carried him through 3 tours in Vietnam. I serve this country, he said, his voice rising, raw with emotion. 3 tours. You can't. But before he could finish, Ryan grabbed his wrist, spinning him around with a force that sent a jolt of pain through James's arthritic joints. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his skin as they snapped shut, and the crowd gathering for the service gasped, their murmurs a mix of shock and confusion. James's mind reeled as he was forced to his knees in the snow, the icy dampness seeping through his pants. Humiliation burned in his chest, mingling with a deep, aching sadness. He thought of Martha, of the promises they'd made to always do good, to make a difference. He thought of the children waiting inside who wouldn't get their gifts tonight. Across the street, Diane watched, her initial fear giving way to a gnawing uncertainty. Had she misjudged? The man's words, his service, his calm demeanor, echoed in her mind, stirring doubt. For Ryan, though, there was no room for second thoughts. He was following protocol, protecting the public. But as he led James to the patrol car, the weight of the moment began to settle, a faint unease tugging at the edges of his certainty. The icy wind bit at James Carter's weathered hands as he trudged through the snow, his arthritic joints protesting with every step. Despite the pain, he clutched the sack of hand-carved wooden toys tightly, each one crafted with care for the children of Grace Community Church. The Christmas Eve blizzard swirled around him, but his heart glowed with the quiet pride of giving, a ritual he'd upheld since Martha's passing 3 years ago. As he approached the church, a small crowd of early worshipers gathered, their faces lit with anticipation for the evening service. But their warmth turned to stunned silence as Officer Daniel Miller's patrol car screeched to a halt beside James. Miller stepped out, his expression hard, his voice sharp with authority. "What are you doing here, old man?" he demanded, eyeing James with suspicion. James, his breath visible in the frigid air, explained calmly that he was delivering gifts for the children, just as he did every year. His voice carried a quiet dignity, but it trembled under the weight of exhaustion and the creeping humiliation of being questioned like a criminal. Miller, unmoved, grabbed James's arm, the force sending a jolt of pain through the old man's shoulder. James winced, his face contorting as his joints screamed, but he refused to let the toys fall. "Please," James said, his voice steady despite the strain, "at least let someone take the gifts inside for the kids." His plea hung in the air, unanswered. Miller's grip tightened, and he shoved James toward the patrol car, ignoring the gasps from the onlookers. "You have the right to remain silent," Miller barked, yanking open the car door. The crowd stood frozen, their shock rendering them mute, but a body camera captured every moment. The harshness of Miller's hands, the quiet resolve in James's eyes, and the sack of toys left abandoned in the snow. The holding cell at Milfield Police Station was a bleak, gray box, its walls radiating a chill that seemed to seep into James's very bones. The handcuffs had been removed, but the weight of indignity lingered, heavier than the thin blanket draped over his shoulders. The Christmas Eve blizzard howled outside, and the station's ancient heating system groaned in defeat. James sat alone on the hard bench, his thoughts drifting to Martha, her laughter, her warmth, the way she'd always made Christmas feel like a miracle. Now, with her gone, the silence was his only companion. The desk sergeant, distracted by a holiday movie flickering on his computer screen, had offered him one phone call. James's heart sank as he considered his options. His son, David, was halfway across the world, sipping cocktails on a Caribbean cruise with his wife and kids. His daughter, Catherine, was in Seattle, 8 months pregnant with twins, her life already stretched thin with anticipation and exhaustion. There was no one to call, so James declined, settling into the familiar solitude that had defined his days since Martha's death. Across town, Officer Miller sat at his desk, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on his paperwork. He filled out the report with mechanical precision, his pen scratching out phrases like suspicious behavior, resisting instructions, and potential threat to public safety. The words felt routine, justified, a tidy summary of an encounter he had already begun to forget. There was no mention of James's military service, his quiet explanation, or the sack of toys now locked away in the evidence room. At 11:30 p.m., Miller clocked out, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he thought of his own family waiting at home, the glow of Christmas lights and the promise of a warm meal. He felt no guilt, only the satisfaction of a job done. Meanwhile, at the Milfield Gazette, Sophia Chen hunched over her computer, the only soul working the holiday desk. The police blotter update pinged on her screen, and her eyes caught on a single line. Elderly man arrested at Grace Community Church. Her brow furrowed. Milfield was a sleepy town of 8,000, where the worst crimes were petty thefts and the occasional bar fight. An elderly man arrested on Christmas Eve? It didn't sit right. Sophia's instincts kicked in, her reporter's curiosity burning through the holiday haze. At 7 a.m. on Christmas morning, she filed a Freedom of Information request for Officer Miller's body camera footage, expecting a delay. To her surprise, a young intern, more eager to spread holiday cheer than to follow protocol, approved the request within hours. By noon, Sophia sat alone in the Gazette's quiet office, the footage playing on her laptop. Her heart sank as she watched James Carter, polite, bewildered, his voice steady as he explained his purpose. She saw Miller's aggression, the way he dismissed James's words, the unnecessary force as he wrenched the old man's arms behind his back. The worst moment came when James's shoulder audibly cracked, a sickening sound that made Sophia flinch. Yet James didn't cry out, his face a mask of stoic endurance, his dignity unbroken even as his body betrayed him. Sophia's hands trembled as she edited the footage, her outrage growing with every frame. By 1 p.m., she uploaded a condensed version to the Gazette's website, the headline blazing, "Christmas Injustice, Veteran Arrested While Delivering Children's Gifts." The story spread like wildfire across Milfield's tight-knit community. Residents recognized James Carter instantly, the gentle veteran who spent hours carving wooden trains and dolls for the town's children, who volunteered at the VFW with a quiet smile, who placed flags on veterans' graves every Memorial Day without fail. By mid-afternoon, the church parking lot was a sea of protesters, their signs demanding justice despite the holiday's pull to stay home. The blizzard had eased, but the air was thick with anger and disbelief. James, meanwhile, had been released at 10 a.m. When the regular desk sergeant, a man who'd known him for decades, took one look at the report and dismissed the charges. "Go home, James," he'd said softly, his voice heavy with apology. James walked the snowy streets back to his small house, each step a reminder of the pain in his shoulder, a dull ache that echoed the deeper wound of the night's humiliation. He didn't speak, didn't cry, just let the silence wrap around him like a familiar cloak. By evening, the story had leaped from Milfield to national news outlets. Veterans organizations issued fiery statements, condemning the treatment of one of their own. On social media, the hashtag #HatchJusticeFor James surged, fueled by shared clips of the body camera footage. The Milfield Police Department's phone lines buzzed incessantly, callers demanding accountability. Chief Robert Thompson's Christmas dinner sat untouched, his phone vibrating with urgent messages as he stared out at the snow, the weight of the scandal settling over him like the storm outside, the weight of countless urgent messages from the mayor, city council, and eventually the state attorney general's office pressed heavily on Chief Thompson's shoulders. Each notification felt like a stone piling onto an already unsteady foundation, threatening to topple his carefully constructed world. When he finally sat down to watch the body camera footage, his heart sank. The images flickered across the screen, stark and undeniable, draining the color from his face as if the very life were seeping out of him. 27 years on the force, decades of navigating crises, mediating disputes, and upholding the law, and yet nothing had prepared him for this. He turned to his wife, his voice barely above a whisper, trembling with a mix of disbelief and shame. "I've never seen anything like this," he murmured, his eyes distant, haunted by the truth the footage revealed. Sometimes justice needs a camera to show what power tries to bury. The press conference room at Milfield City Hall buzzed with an electric tension, packed to the brim with reporters craning their necks for a better view. Local journalists, their notepads clutched tightly, stood shoulder to shoulder with national news crews, their cameras trained on the podium like hawks eyeing prey. The story that had drawn them here was as shocking as it was heartbreaking. An elderly veteran, James Carter, handcuffed and left in the snow on Christmas Eve, his dignity stripped away in the biting cold. The room pulsed with anticipation, the air thick with the weight of an unfolding scandal. Camera flashes lit up Chief Thompson's pale, drawn face as he stepped up to the podium at precisely 10 a.m. on December 26th. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but laced with a quiet anguish that betrayed the turmoil within. He adjusted his glasses, but they did nothing to shield the reddened, weary eyes that had spent the night wrestling with guilt. "I'm here to address a deeply troubling incident that occurred on Christmas Eve involving Mr. James Carter, a respected veteran and a cherished member of our Milfield community." He paused, clearing his throat, the sound amplified in the hushed room. After thoroughly reviewing the body camera footage and conducting interviews with all parties involved, I must acknowledge a painful truth. Mr. Carter was treated in a manner that violated not only our department's values, but the very principles of human dignity. The silence in the room deepened, every word Thompson spoke landing like a gavel. His hands gripped the podium, knuckles whitening as he forced himself to continue, each syllable measured, deliberate, and heavy with accountability. "The officer involved has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. But more importantly, I have personally reached out to Mr. Carter to offer my deepest apologies for the physical and emotional pain he endured while in our custody. No one should suffer as he did, least of all a man who has served his country and community with such honor." A voice pierced the quiet, sharp, and insistent. "Will Officer Miller face charges for the injury to Mr. Carter's shoulder?" a reporter shouted. Thompson's gaze dropped for a moment, his jaw tightening as he nodded gravely. "That decision rests with the county prosecutor's office, which now has all relevant evidence in its possession. What I can say is this incident is a failure of leadership, my leadership." The room erupted in murmurs, but Thompson pressed on, his voice rising slightly to quell the noise. "Effective immediately, I am resigning as chief of police." And the announcement hit like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through the crowded room. For 11 years, Thompson had been a steady hand at the helm of the Milfield Police Department, guiding it through budget cuts, modernization efforts, and community outreach programs with a quiet confidence that had earned him respect. Now that legacy lay in tatters. He raised a hand to silence the flurry of questions, his expression resolute yet broken. "A department is a reflection of its leadership," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I failed to instill the values of compassion and accountability in my officers. I failed to foster a culture where authority is tempered with humanity. Most of all, I failed Mr. Carter, a man who deserved our protection, not our persecution." As he stepped away from the podium, the weight of his words lingered, heavy and unshakable, in the stunned silence. Across town, in the quiet chapel of Milfield General Hospital, James Carter sat in a wheelchair, his weathered hands folded in his lap. The sterile scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint warmth of the chapel's wooden pews, a small refuge from the chaos of the past 2 days. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, the result of a torn rotator cuff that would require surgery and months of grueling physical therapy. The diagnosis had hit him hard, not just for the physical toll, but for the memories it stirred. At 72, James had endured his share of battles, both on foreign soil and in the quiet struggles of civilian life. But this betrayal by those meant to protect him, cut deeper than any wound he'd ever known. As the doctor stepped out, a soft knock at the door broke his reverie. "Mr. Carter?" a nurse said, her voice gentle but hesitant. "There are some people here to see you." Ooh, James looked up, his eyes widening as the small chapel filled with familiar faces. Church members who'd shared countless Sunday mornings with him, neighbors who'd waved from their porches, fellow veterans who understood the unspoken bond of service. Pastor Mike stepped forward, his face etched with a solemn determination. "James," he said, his voice warm but firm, "we're here to remind you that you're not alone. The community has come together to establish the James Carter Veteran Support Fund. We've already raised enough to cover your medical bills and support you through your recovery." James blinked, his throat tightening as he struggled to process the words. Before he could respond, a younger man in a Marine Corps sweatshirt stepped forward, his posture rigid with respect. "Sir, I'm Alex Reyes, commander of the local VFW post," he said, his voice steady but tinged with admiration. "We've organized volunteers to take care of your home needs, meals, errands, transportation to your medical appointments. Whatever you need, we've got you covered." The room seemed to blur as James's eyes welled up, the weight of their kindness overwhelming him. For years, he'd been the one to serve, organizing toy drives for children, volunteering at the local shelter, quietly helping neighbors without fanfare. To be on the receiving end of such support felt foreign, almost disorienting, and yet it warmed a part of his heart he hadn't realized had gone cold. Later that afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the hospital room's blinds, another visitor arrived. Diane Miller stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly, her face pale with regret. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling as she stepped closer, "I needed to see you in person to apologize. I'm new to Milfield, and I didn't know about your tradition of dressing as Santa for the kids on Christmas Eve. When I saw you in my yard, I got scared for my children and called the police. I had no idea it would lead to this." James looked at her, his weathered face softening. He saw the guilt in her eyes, the way her hands fidgeted, and he felt a pang of empathy. She hadn't meant harm. She'd been a mother acting on instinct, caught in a moment of fear. "Diane," he said, his voice steady despite the pain in his shoulder, "I understand. You were protecting your family. Let's leave it in the past." His words were a quiet absolution, a bridge over the chasm that had opened between them that fateful night. Diane's eyes brimmed with tears, and she nodded, whispering a soft, "Thank you," before stepping back, her heart a little lighter but still heavy with the weight of unintended consequences. As the day faded into evening, James sat alone, gazing out the window at the snow-dusted streets of Milfield. The events of Christmas Eve replayed in his mind, the cold bite of the handcuffs, the humiliation, the searing pain in his shoulder. But so did the outpouring of support that followed. The community's embrace, the chief's resignation, Diane's apology, it all wove together into a complex tapestry of human failure and redemption. For the first time in days, a faint smile touched his lips. The truth had been seen, not just by a camera, but by the hearts of those around him. And in that truth, he found a flicker of hope that justice, however delayed, could still prevail. The air in Milfield carried a faint warmth as spring unfurled, coaxing crocuses to pierce through the thawing earth in the church gardens and coaxing soft blades of grass to reclaim the town square. The snow that had blanketed the town during James Carter's public ordeal had melted away, as if nature itself sought to erase the memory of that bitter winter day. Yet for the people of Milfield, healing was not as simple as the changing seasons. It was a slow, deliberate process, marked by quiet resolve and a shared determination to mend what had been broken. The community's wounds, like James's own, were still tender, but the promise of renewal hung in the air, fragile yet undeniable. In the hospital room where James Carter lay, the soft hum of fluorescent lights mingled with the distant clatter of nurses' footsteps. A gentle knock broke the stillness, pulling James from his thoughts. He turned his head, wincing slightly as his bandaged shoulder protested the movement. Standing in the doorway was former Chief Thompson, his broad frame slightly stooped, his face etched with a mix of weariness and resolve. In his hands, he clutched James's worn canvas bag, its edges frayed from years of use. "I thought you might want these," Thompson said, his voice low, almost reverent, as he set the bag beside James's bed. "They're a day late, but they're yours as intended." The words carried a weight that went beyond the simple act of returning a bag. For Thompson, it was an offering, a small gesture to bridge the chasm of regret that had grown between them. His career, once defined by authority and certainty, had crumbled under the weight of one wrong decision. Yet, in this moment, he stood not as a disgraced chief, but as a man seeking redemption, hoping to restore a fragment of trust. James looked at the bag, then at Thompson. His eyes, weathered by years of service and pain, held no trace of anger, only a quiet understanding. He knew what it meant to carry burdens, some visible, like the sling cradling his injured shoulder, and others hidden, like the memories of a life spent defending ideals larger than himself. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady but soft, as if acknowledging the gesture was enough for now. In that exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that truth and courage, though costly, could still carve a path forward. The police department, too, was undergoing its own transformation, a mirror to the town's tentative rebirth. Interim Chief Diana Ortiz took the helm with a steady hand and a heart attuned to the community's needs. A veteran of 20 years, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the best and worst of humanity. Her first act as chief was to implement mandatory training programs, designed to teach officers how to approach interactions with elderly residents and veterans with the care they deserved. No longer would assumptions or haste define their work. Diana envisioned a department woven into the fabric of Milfield, not standing apart from it. Officers now spent one day each month volunteering alongside the people they served, building wheelchair ramps, delivering meals, or simply listening to stories at the local VA hospital. These were not just tasks, but bridges, small acts of connection meant to prevent crises before they could erupt. Diana's own heart swelled with cautious hope as she watched her officers, once rigid in their routines, begin to see the faces behind the calls they answered. For Officer Miller, the path to redemption was steeper. The memory of his actions during James's ordeal haunted him, a shadow that lingered in the mirror each morning. He had chosen to stay in Milfield, despite the whispers and sidelong glances from neighbors who hadn't forgotten. Sensitivity training and hours spent volunteering at the VA hospital had forced him to confront his own shortcomings. He listened to veterans' stories, their voices thick with pride and pain, and felt the weight of his mistakes settle deeper into his bones. Transferring to administrative duties was not an escape, but a commitment to face his errors head-on. Slowly, grudgingly, the town began to see him not as the officer who had faltered, but as a man willing to rebuild. Even his fiercest critics, those who had once called for his resignation, began to nod in acknowledgement when they passed him on the street. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. James Carter's recovery was slower, marked by quiet victories and persistent setbacks. His shoulder, shattered in the incident that had upended his life, healed unevenly, leaving him with limited mobility. The pain was a constant companion, a reminder of the fragility of the body he had once pushed to its limits in service to his country. Yet by Easter, he was back in his workshop, the familiar scent of cedar and pine wrapping around him like an old friend. His hands, though less steady, still moved with purpose, adapting his wood-carving techniques to accommodate his new reality. Each toy he crafted now bore a small stamp, a shield with the letters BTC, Bridge the Community. It was a quiet nod to the foundation established in his name, a symbol of his determination to turn pain into purpose. As he carved, James thought of the children who would hold these toys, their laughter a small rebellion against the darkness he had endured. His heart, though scarred, felt lighter with each piece he finished, as if he were carving out a space for hope. The James Carter Veteran Service Scholarship became Milfield's beacon of change. That spring, it awarded its first grants to children of veterans pursuing careers in public service. Funded entirely by community donations, the scholarship was more than financial aid. It was a testament to Milfield's resolve to transform a moment of injustice into a legacy of good. Each donation, Whether a handful of coins from a child's piggy bank or a generous check from a local business carried a story of faith in second chances. For James, reading the applications was both humbling and heart-wrenching. He saw his younger self in the words of these young dreamers, their aspirations for justice and service echoing the ideals he had carried through war and back home. The scholarship wasn't just about education, it was about building a future where trust could take root again. On Memorial Day, the cemetery in Milfield stood solemn under a sky streaked with clouds. Flags fluttered gently over veterans' graves, each one a story of sacrifice. James stood at the entrance beside former Chief Thompson, their hands steady as they passed out fresh flags to visitors. No words were needed between them. Their shared silence spoke of mutual respect, forged through the crucible of their shared history. James's thoughts drifted to the oath he had taken decades ago, a promise to protect what mattered. He glanced at Thompson, whose own career had been a different kind of battlefield, one where pride and mistakes had clashed. Different uniforms, James said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of their journey. Same oath to protect what matters. Thompson nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The hardest battles are the ones we fight with ourselves, he replied, his voice thick with the lessons of his fall. No one should face injustice, especially those who've given so much for their country. Standing for truth means owning our mistakes, no matter how much it costs. In that moment, they were not a veteran and a former chief, but two men bound by a shared understanding of duty and redemption. For those who heard James's story, it stirred memories of their own. One listener thought of their grandfather, a World War II veteran, whose quiet dignity had shaped their understanding of respect. James's resilience was a mirror, reflecting the enduring fight for justice in a world quick to judge and slow to heal. His story wasn't just about one man's pain or one town's reckoning. It was a call to listen deeper, to act with compassion, and to stand for what was right, even when it demanded courage. Milfield's transformation, like James's own, was a reminder that change began with small, deliberate steps. Steps that together could lead to a future where trust was not just fragile, but unbreakable.